ובכלל אזהרה זו שלא יהא שני בתי דינים בעיר אחת. Here we're talking about not having two bate din, two halachic authorities in the one town. I know this sounds like science fiction to people nowadays, but that is how things are supposed to be. That there should be unity, at least on the local level, at the very least, so that in each town, each yishuv, each neighborhood, there should be one beth din with one set of practices, psakim, etc. Not that the people are splintered and fractured amongst themselves. So Rambam, and this is based on an explicit statement in the Sifrei, in the Talmud, Masechet Yevamot, ובכלל הזרה זו שלא יהיו שני בתי דינים בעיר אחת. זה נוהג במנהג זה, וזה נוהג במנהג אחר. Such a reality where you have different groups within the same society is not healthy. Why? שדבר זה גורם למחלוקת גדולה. That may sound familiar. וכתוב לא תתגודדו, לא תעשו אגודות אגודות. Clearly that's not the pshat of the pasuk. It's obviously an asmachta, but it is nevertheless a powerful statement. It's a very powerful statement, which should provide food for thought for all of us. This, of course, raises the question: what about the fact that you have, shall we say, Ashkenazim and Sephardim, and Temanim and Gruzin and Bukharim, what have you? If we're talking about, it could be a suburb in Brooklyn, in New York, where you have Jews from different backgrounds, shall we say, different whose ancestors came from different parts of the world with different piskei halacha, different minhagim. And it could be true in Eretz Yisrael, where you have a large melting pot, shall we say, of Jews, of communities from all over the world. The standard approach is that olam kaminharo noheg. Everybody must continue the minharim and the psakim of their forefathers, which of course means in practice that this idea of lo te'asu agudot agudot ela hayu kulochem aguda ahat, which is the lashon of the Sifrei. In other words, it's not just stated in the negative; it's also stated in the positive. Lo te'asu or lo te'yu agudot agudot. Do not live and conduct yourselves and organize yourselves as agudot, as separate factions and groups. That is the explicit statement of Hazal in the Sifrei. Clearly, this policy and this approach that Ashkenazim must remain Ashkenazim for all time and Sfaradim must remain Sfaradim for all time, and the same is true for other idot, other groups, other communities. This clearly is not in accordance with this statement and this clear instruction of Chazal. And therefore, the correct thing would be for in each neighborhood or each town to have one halachic authority, and the previous identities of Ashkenazi and Sfaradi should officially be relinquished and would over time disappear. Yes, it wouldn't happen overnight, that is true. Nor does it have to happen overnight. But it should happen. And that, of course, raises another question. If that's the case, and you want to have one halachic authority, one set of minhagim for Jews in a certain place, so who's going to call the shots? Are the Sfaradim going to tell the Ashkenazim what to do, or the other way around, for example, or the Temanim or someone else? And the answer to that, I think, is that it won't work that way, nor should it work that way. And that is essentially the idea behind and the motivation, or one of the motivations certainly behind what I've referred to for many, many years as Torah Eretz Yisrael. Jews, but certainly in Eretz Yisrael should lead the way and show the way when it comes to such things. Jews in Eretz Yisrael should develop and implement a form of Torah, of authentic Torah Judaism, based on all the authentic ancient sources, and do it in such a way that it would be acceptable and seem reasonable and proper in the eyes of all. If people wish, of course, to be reasonable and to act properly and to do the right thing. But if a person is unwilling to do so, then it won't happen. And we live, unfortunately, to this day in a time when most Jews simply do not get it. They are too stuck in their ways, on the one hand, and to a large extent that the blame must be placed at the doors of Rabbanim. Because for Rabbanim, this would require them to actually make an effort. In other words, to get out of their own skin, as it were, and re-examine certain things and be willing to embark on a new and more correct and more constructive and positive direction. But that would require making changes, or considering even having to make changes, which means that you cannot simply work based on the same playbook as before, and that requires an effort. And most human beings are just not interested or willing to make an effort. But the Torah clearly instructs us to do this. The Chachamim clearly instruct us to do precisely this thing, to make such an effort and to view this as a as a necessary and desirable aim for Jews everywhere. So, Bezrat Hashem, Od Hazon LaMoed.
How would you respond to those who make arguments of false humility, something along the lines of, who are we to change what certain people have instituted or certain ideas people have had, and thus refuse to change anything?
I'm glad you asked that question. I could answer that on many levels, in many ways. Many, many years ago, I had a conversation with a certain elderly Haredi Yerushalmi gentleman in the Beth Knesset that was next to my home at that time. And we sort of got to know each other over time to some extent. And once we had a discussion which touched upon this point. And I asked him, why do you wear this dress that you wear, this particular mode of apparel? And he said, because this is what my father and my grandfather wore. And I said, that might be so. And by the way, I'm not saying he was dressed improperly. I'm just saying that he was dressed in a particular style. He was what's called a Yerushalmi, a long suit and a particular kind of hat and what have you. And he said, because that's what my father and my grandfather wore. And I said, that might be the case, but you should be aware, I imagine, that if you were to go back a few more generations, let's say 300 years, or 500 years, certainly 1,000 years, you would find that your ancestors did not dress in this particular style. He didn't really respond to that. He didn't really agree or disagree, but we all know that's the fact. Clearly, if his ancestors were, let's say, medieval Germany, they didn't wear exactly that attire that he was wearing, which is essentially a copy and paste from the wardrobe of a Polish nobleman in the 18th century. So his ancestors didn't always wear that dress, and if you go back further in time, you would discover it was even more different. he didn't have a response to that. So I said, so therefore it's not true that you may not change, by definition, the type of clothing, shall we say, that you wear, as compared to that of earlier generations, because your ancestors did exactly that at various points in history. Clearly, that's what they did. He didn't know what to respond to that. In general, Haredim and many other people do not have any kind of historical perspective on reality. But he said, I don't know about that, but I do know that I'm not allowed to change. That was his response. I'm not allowed to change from this particular mode of dress. Now, I understand exactly why he wears that mode of dress, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. But the idea that we cannot make any change, and that changes have not occurred over the centuries and millennia, is clearly untrue. That's number one. The same, of course, is true of pronunciation of Lashon HaKodesh. It's not the case. We all know. Again, he wouldn't know this, but we know this, that the way he pronounced Lashon HaKodesh is not identical to the way his ancestors, if you go back many generations, pronounced Lashon HaKodesh. It depends how far back you go, but it certainly things changed and evolved over time for all kinds of reasons. Now, again, we understand. He would not understand, not being a particularly erudite or intellectual person, but he just knows this is what he was taught in Cheder, and that's what you do, and that's how you say it. Fine, that's as far as that goes, that's true, but that doesn't mean that your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather pronounced it exactly in that fashion. And we know that that's not the case. We even know, for example, of that many Ashkenazim today were originally Sfaradim. In other words, they were expelled from Spain, or they escaped later from Portugal and other places, and ended up in Ashkenazi lands. And lo and behold, after a certain period of time at least, they sound like everybody else. So how did that happen? Well, we know exactly how these things happened. It's called human nature. It's called sociology. It's anthropology. There are entire faculties that can explain all of these things to you in detail if you wish. But it's really self-evident. There are also all kinds of historical, cultural phenomena that bring about such changes. Sometimes very abruptly and suddenly, and other times more gradually. So we understand that this is the reality of human existence, all human existence. When it comes to language and when it comes to dress, these things are always in a state of flux. But the real reason that people make this argument that, well, we haven't got the authority, or we're not clever enough to know how to change, or what new direction to point ourselves in. The real reason people say this is what I said before. It's the easy and cop-out answer. If you convince yourself that you're not allowed to change, then you're obviously exempt from having to consider the matter. You don't have to investigate what's right, what's less correct, what's more correct, what did my ancestors actually say or pronounce or dress or do on this or that matter 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. That requires an effort, a mental effort, maybe also a spiritual effort, an intellectual effort, maybe a philosophical effort. But if your approach is simply, we are not allowed to make any change, well, that's a very pleasant and comfortable response. If your aim really is not to do anything, not to make any changes, not to come to grips with any real life new situation or evolving situation. And the same is true, for example, of many people when it comes to many things. Of course, we all know that on the human level, on the individual level, people will often make excuses for what they do or do not do, and they will explain, rationalize what they do or do not do for all kinds of reasons. But we know the real reason is something entirely different. And I'll give you another example, which has nothing to do with any of these issues that we touched upon today, but it is very relevant, I believe. In the religious Zionist world, for example, they have their own they have their own mythology, just as the Haredim have their own mythology. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about Torah. We're not talking about Da'ath Torah. We're talking about mythologies. It is for various reasons, and I understand these reasons very well, and I'm not saying simplistically that tomorrow all Haredim must go to the army. I'm not going to go into that whole discussion, but that's not what I'm saying. And I understand why we're in the current situation. But it is clearly convenient and desirable and expedient for the Haredi world to have invented new concepts, false concepts in Torah, such as people who study Torah are exempt from military service. That's not true. It's not true for 101 reasons. I won't go into them right now. Perhaps on another occasion I'll devote a shiur to this. The claim that is made based on what Rambam writes at the end of Vichol Shemikta Yovel, and with regards to Shevet Levi, is in no way any proof for this position. It's rumored, at least, so I've heard, that Gaon Rabbi Issa Zalman Meltzer, who wrote the many volumes on the Rambam called Even HaEzel, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Bar-Hayim in Yerushalayim, let's say 100 years ago, or up to perhaps, I don't know exactly, 70 years ago, perhaps. So he wrote, as we said, many books on the Rambam, and it's reported, at least, that he said that I've learned a little bit of Rambam, and I haven't yet found in the Rambam any reason why a Bachur Yeshiva cannot or should not go to the army. He would be considered Haredi, by the way, by anybody today, but that's apparently what he said. And it doesn't matter if that's what he actually said or not, or if that's just a story. That I haven't got proof of that rumor, but it's true. In other words, it's convenient for a certain community or for certain Rabbanim, for certain obvious reasons, to make such a claim, because they have a certain agenda, and this serves that agenda. But it doesn't make it true. It doesn't make it Da'ath Torah. It makes it the public policy of a certain group for a particular reason. The particular reason is very simple. We know that. The reason is not because of this or that Rambam, or because of this or that claim that some of them make, but because they are concerned, rightly so, that young Haredi men who go to the army will not leave as young Haredi men, and that the army will bring about a major change for the worse in their entire approach and attitude and way of life vis-a-vis the Torah. And this is not some wild or far-fetched notion. It's very, very real world. That's the true and central motivation, perhaps the only motivation. You could add to that other things, such as they don't identify with this or that, or that's entirely true also. But that's the central matter. So just as the Haredim have that kind of mythology that they create for themselves, the religious Zionists also have their own mythology. In other words, they have their own excuses for everything. So when you begin to point out to such people various problems and issues that exist in Israeli society and in the reality of the Jewish people, and that a certain situation is untenable and unacceptable, and things must change. Often they will say to you, "Kim'a, kim'a," which means slowly, slowly, literally. They will tell you they learned this from the Yerushalmi. They will tell you in Masechet Berachot, where two Chachamim were walking around in the Galil at the time of the dawn, and they began to see the dawn come up from the east. And one said to the other, "Such is the Geula of Yisrael, kach geulatam she Yisrael, kim'a kim'a." That as the light also begins to increase slowly, gradually over time, so it is with the Geula. Okay, that's an important statement which can be discussed and should be discussed, but that is not the real reason why they respond in that way. The reason they respond in that way is because they are psychologically, emotionally, intellectually incapable of doing anything about the problem. And en bahem kohot hanefesh. They do not possess that which is required to analyze the situation, see the problem, define it, and then hopefully discuss a true, real, meaningful solution or response to that reality. They're incapable of doing it. So they exempt themselves from having to do that by, just as that Haredi, that old Haredi gentleman, very fine man, I knew him quite well, said, I'm not allowed to change the way I dress. Whatever you tell me about what my forefathers may have done many generations ago, I'm not allowed to change my dress. In the same way, because that's what he wants to do. He doesn't want to change. I'm not even saying he should have changed necessarily, but it's not even up for discussion. In the same way, it's not up for discussion for them to do anything which would imply that the current regime of Am Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael has to be completely dismantled and replaced. They're incapable of discussing such a thing. And why? Because they're religious Zionists. In other words, they're Zionists with a kippah on their head. So you have to accept, according to that ideology, you have to accept the status quo. You have to accept the way things are, and you cannot question them too much. And you have to demonstrate constantly your allegiance to the powers that be. So when they say kim'a kim'a, your problem is with you, not with the reality. The reality is fine. The reality will evolve and change slowly over time, so they will tell you. The problem is with you, because you are in a rush. They turn the whole thing on its head. The person who sees the problem and can define it and analyze it, and also point at the correct direction and then the correct approach that might lead to something changing for the better. That person is the problem, because they're in a big rush. They're never satisfied. They're not patient. Their problem is the lack of patience. So they turn their inability, their lack of creativity, their lack of intellectual capacity, their lack of psychological and emotional strength, they turn that into a virtue. They have all the patience in the world, and they will have all the patience in the world. They will never do anything, because that's just who they are, until they change. As long as they are religious Zionists, they will never be able to conceive of anything truly different. But they turn that into a virtue, and the people who see the problem and speak about it, and therefore see things that they cannot see, they are the problem, because they lack patience. I've heard this. I've had such statements directed at me personally and at many other people for decades. And the problem is not with the people who see the problem. The problem is with the people who are incapable of admitting that there is a problem. which would then require them to do something, perhaps, which they're incapable of doing or they're unwilling to do. So all such arguments, we're not allowed to do this, we cannot do that, who are we, etc. These are all excuses and not reasons. I always distinguish between excuses and reasons. The real reasons for something are often comprehensible, but they're not always the excuses that people make to deflect various ideas or claims or difficult questions.